The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Washington's front yard as he carefully tended to his roses. At 72, he moved more slowly than he once did, but his hands were still steady and sure. These roses had been his pride for almost 30 years now, ever since his wife Doris had planted the first bushes. She was gone now, 5 years this past April, but caring for her roses made him feel close to her. Harold stood up straight, pressing his hand against the small of his back as he stretched. His bones protested with a few audible pops, making him chuckle. "Getting old ain't for the weak," he muttered to himself, a phrase his father used to say. The neighborhood was quiet this Thursday morning. Harold looked up and down the street, taking in the sight of the place he'd called home for over 40 years. When he and Doris had first moved in, they were one of only 3 black families on the block. Now the neighborhood was a mix of everybody: young families, retirees, folks from all backgrounds. Times had changed, mostly for the better, though Harold knew better than most that progress wasn't always a straight line. He gathered his gardening tools and placed them neatly in the small shed beside his garage. His stomach rumbled, reminding him it was time for his morning ritual, a walk to Maggie's coffee shop 3 blocks over for their Thursday special, blueberry scones and dark roast coffee. Harold went inside to wash up. He caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His close-cropped hair had gone completely white years ago, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but his brown eyes were still sharp and alert. He'd been told more than once that he had a dignified look about him. 40 years on the bench as a judge would do that to a person, he supposed. He changed out of his gardening clothes into a pair of comfortable slacks and a light blue button-up shirt. Nothing fancy, but Doris had always insisted on looking presentable in public. "You never know who you might run into," she would say. Before heading out, Harold grabbed his wallet, keys, and the cell phone his granddaughter Tanya had insisted. "Hey, Carrie, it's not just for emergencies, Grandpa," she'd explained. "It's so I can send you pictures of the kids whenever I want." That had been reason enough for Harold. The air was warm, but not yet hot, as he stepped outside and locked his front door. Mrs. Patel from next door waved from her porch where she was watering her hanging plants. "Good morning, Judge Washington. Going for your walk?" she called out. "Good morning, Indira." "Yes, ma'am. Got a date with a blueberry scone," he called back with a smile. Harold had been retired for 7 years now, but neighbors still called him Judge. He didn't mind. He'd worked hard for that title, breaking barriers along the way. Being one of the first black judges in the county meant something, especially to the younger folks in the community who needed to see what was possible. He set off down the sidewalk at a steady pace. His doctor had told him walking was the best exercise for someone his age, and Harold took that advice seriously. 20 minutes a day keeps the doctor away, he'd joke whenever anyone commented on his daily walks. Harold had gone about 1.5 blocks when he noticed a police cruiser driving slowly alongside him. He didn't think much of it at first. Police patrolled the neighborhood regularly, but when the cruiser slowed to match his pace, a familiar tension crept into his shoulders. The window rolled down, revealing 2 officers, one white man who looked to be in his 30s and a younger, Hispanic officer. The white officer, whose nameplate read Peterson, spoke first. "Good morning, sir. Mind if we have a word with you?" Harold stopped walking and turned toward the car, keeping his hands visible at his sides, a habit he'd developed over decades of being a black man in America. "Not at all, officers. How can I help you?" His voice was steady and calm. Officer Peterson stepped out of the car, his partner following suit. "We received a call about a suspicious person in the area. Would you mind telling us what you're doing in this neighborhood?" Harold felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. "I live here, have for over 40 years. My house is the blue one with the white trim, just 3 doors down from where we turned onto this street." The younger officer, Ramirez, according to his nameplate, glanced in the direction Harold had indicated, but Peterson kept his eyes fixed on Harold. "I'm going to need to see some ID, sir," Peterson said, his hand resting casually near his holster. Harold took a slow, deep breath. "May I ask why I'm being stopped? I'm simply walking to the coffee shop as I do every morning." Peterson's expression hardened slightly. "Sir, When an officer asks for identification, you're required to provide it. We've had reports of break-ins in the area. Harold knew his rights. As a former judge, he knew them better than most, but he also knew the reality of situations like this. Carefully, he reached for his wallet. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket," he narrated as he moved, another long-learned habit. As he handed over his driver's license, he noticed Mrs. Chen from across the street had come out onto her porch and was watching the interaction with concern. Down the block, a young couple had slowed their morning jog to observe. Officer Peterson examined the license with exaggerated thoroughness. "Harold Washington. This address is on Maple Street. That's not this street." "Yes, Maple is the next street over. As I mentioned, my house is just around the corner, 3 doors down," Harold explained patiently. "So you're not actually on your street," Peterson said, his tone suggesting he'd caught Harold in a lie. Harold kept his voice level. "I'm walking in my neighborhood, which, last I checked, wasn't against the law." Officer Ramirez shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his partner and Harold. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands on the car while we run your information," Peterson said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Is that really necessary?" Harold asked. "I've told you who I am and where I live." "Hands on the car, sir. Now." Peterson's voice hardened. Harold could feel the eyes of his neighbors watching. Mrs. Chen had her phone out now. A few more people had gathered on porches and sidewalks, drawn by the unusual sight of police activity in their quiet neighborhood. Slowly, with dignity that came from decades of holding his head high in the face of prejudice, Harold placed his hands on the police cruiser. The cool metal beneath his palms was a stark contrast to the warmth of the morning. "I believe this stop is unwarranted and based solely on my race," Harold stated clearly, loud enough for the growing number of witnesses to hear. Peterson's face flushed red. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "Am I being arrested?" Harold asked, disbelief coloring his voice. "On what charge?" "You're being detained for questioning. You match the description of a suspicious person in the area." "And what description is that? An elderly black man walking down the sidewalk in broad daylight?" Instead of answering, Peterson roughly turned Harold around and pulled his wrists behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Harold's skin as they were fastened too, tightly around his wrists. "These are too tight," Harold said, wincing slightly. Peterson ignored him. "Watch your head," he said mechanically as he guided Harold into the back seat of the patrol car. From inside the car, Harold could see more neighbors gathering. Mrs. Chen was definitely recording now. Mr. Rodriguez from the house with the big oak tree was gesturing animatedly as he spoke to Officer Ramirez. Harold sat as comfortably as he could with his hands cuffed behind him. The indignity of the situation wasn't lost on him, but neither was the familiar nature of it. Even at 72, even after a lifetime of service to the community and the law, he was still just a suspicious person to some. As Peterson got back into the driver's seat and began radioing in, Harold thought about all the young black men he'd seen in his courtroom over the years, caught up in situations just like this that had escalated beyond reason. He thought about the talks he'd had with his son, and later his grandson, about how to behave when stopped by police. The same talk his father had given him more than 60 years ago. Harold's wrists throbbed from the tight handcuffs, but his mind remained clear. This wasn't just happening to him. It was happening to every person who looked like him, who didn't have the benefit of neighbors watching, who didn't have the vocabulary to articulate their rights, who didn't have the connections he had built over a lifetime of public service. As Officer Peterson continued his radio conversation, describing Harold as uncooperative, Harold made a decision. He had spent his life working within the system to change it. Now he would use that same system to hold these officers accountable, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been stopped for the crime of walking while black. Harold looked out the window at his gathered neighbors, their faces showing concern and outrage on his behalf. He caught Mrs. Chen's eye and gave her a small, reassuring nod. Then he turned his attention to the officers in the front seat. He had one phone call to make, and he knew exactly who to call. The inside of the police cruiser was cold, the air conditioning blasting despite the mild morning outside. Harold shifted uncomfortably, the handcuffs digging into his wrists. Through the window, he could see more neighbors gathering on the sidewalk. Mrs. Chen was still recording with her phone, and Mr. Rodriguez appeared to be arguing with Officer Ramirez. "Look at that," Officer Peterson muttered to his partner. "Now we've got the whole neighborhood coming out. Just what we need. Maybe we should just verify his address and let him go," Ramirez suggested quietly. "He says he lives right around the corner." Peterson shot his partner a look. "We got a call about a suspicious person. We're doing our job. Don't go soft on me now." Harold kept his face neutral, though he was listening carefully. The younger officer seemed uncomfortable with the situation, which might work in his favor. A tap on the window startled all three men. Mrs. Patel, Harold's next-door neighbor, was standing there with her arms crossed. Peterson rolled down his window just a crack. "Officers, what are you doing with Judge Washington?" Her voice was firm, her Indian accent more pronounced in her anger. "Ma'am, please step back from the vehicle. This is police business," Peterson replied. "Police business? This man is my neighbor of 15 years. He is a retired judge. What crime has he committed?" Mrs. Patel wasn't backing down. Harold could see Peterson's neck reddening. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. Step away from the vehicle or you could be arrested for interfering with police duties." Mrs. Patel looked past Peterson directly at Harold. "Do you need me to call anyone, Judge?" Before Harold could answer, Peterson rolled up the window and turned to his partner. "Call for backup. This crowd is getting out of hand." "Backup?" Ramirez looked surprised. "It's just a few neighbors asking questions." "Just do it," Peterson snapped. Harold cleared his throat. "Officer, I'd like to make a phone call." Peterson turned around, eyeing Harold suspiciously. "This isn't a movie. You don't get a phone call until you're booked." "Actually," Harold said calmly, "according to state law, a detained individual has the right to notify someone of their situation, provided it doesn't interfere with an ongoing investigation. Since I'm merely being detained and not under arrest, and since you've already searched me and secured me in your vehicle, I believe allowing me to make a call wouldn't interfere with whatever investigation you're conducting." Peterson stared at him, clearly thrown by Harold's knowledge of the law. "He's right," Ramirez said quietly. "It's Section 825.5 of the Code." Peterson's jaw tightened. "Fine. Who do you want to call? Your lawyer?" "In a manner of speaking," Harold replied. Ramirez reached for Harold's phone, which had been placed in the center console along with his wallet and keys. "Here, I'll hold it for you since your hands are—" He glanced at the tight handcuffs and frowned slightly. "I'll dial for you. What's the number?" Harold recited a number from memory, watching as Ramirez punched it in and then held the phone to Harold's ear. It rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "Chief Roberts' office. How may I help you?" "Good morning, Linda. This is Harold. Washington. Is Michael available? It's rather urgent." There was a pause on the other end. "Judge Washington." "Yes, let me get him right away." Harold could see Peterson watching him in the rearview mirror, eyes narrowed with suspicion. After a moment, a deep voice came on the line. "Harold, what's going on? Linda said it was urgent." "Michael, I seem to find myself in an unusual situation," Harold said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm currently handcuffed in the back of a patrol car outside my own neighborhood." "You're what?" The shock in Chief Roberts' voice was evident even through the phone's small speaker. "Yes, that's correct. I was taking my morning walk when Officers Peterson and Ramirez stopped me, questioned me about my presence in my own neighborhood, and placed me in handcuffs when I suggested the stop might be racially motivated." There was a beat of silence on the line. When Chief Roberts spoke again, his voice had changed from friendly to official. "Put one of the officers on the phone." Harold glanced at Ramirez, who was still holding the phone. "The chief would like to speak with one of you." Ramirez looked at Peterson, who shook his head sharply. But Ramirez, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing, put the phone to his own ear. "This is Officer Ramirez, sir." A pause. "Yes, sir." Another pause, longer this time. "Judge Washington, sir? Are you sure?" His eyes widened as he looked at Harold with new understanding. "Yes, sir." "Right away, sir." When Ramirez handed the phone back to Peterson, his face had gone pale. "That was Chief Roberts. He wants us to release Judge Washington immediately and apologize." "Judge Washington?" Peterson repeated, looking at Harold in the rearview mirror with disbelief. "Yes," Ramirez hissed. "Harold Washington, the former chief judge who sits on the Police Conduct Review Board, the one who swore in half the department, including the chief himself." Harold watched the realization dawn on Peterson's face, followed quickly by something that looked like fear. "He's sending a lieutenant over now," Ramirez continued, his voice strained. "And he wants to speak with both of us back at the station when our shift ends." Peterson's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Why didn't you say who you were?" he demanded, looking at Harold in the mirror. "Would it have made a difference?" Harold asked quietly. "Should it make a difference? Would you have treated any other 72-year-old black man differently if you knew he wasn't a judge?" Peterson didn't answer, but his face said everything. "I'd appreciate it if you'd remove these handcuffs now," Harold said. "They're quite uncomfortable." Ramirez quickly got out and opened the back door. As he helped Harold out and removed the handcuffs, Harold could see the crowd of neighbors had grown. Mrs. Chen was still filming, and a few people clapped when they saw the handcuffs come off. Harold rubbed his wrists, wincing at the red marks left by the too tight cuffs. Mrs. Patel rushed over, putting a protective arm around his shoulders. "Are you all right, Judge?" she asked, glaring at the officers. "I'm fine, Indira. Thank you for your concern," Harold assured her, though his wrists throbbed painfully. A new police car pulled up, and a lieutenant Harold recognized stepped out. Lieutenant Winters had attended several community policing workshops Harold had helped organize after retirement. "Judge Washington," Winters said, walking over quickly, "I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am about this misunderstanding." "Is that what we're calling it?" Harold asked mildly. "A misunderstanding?" Winters had the good grace to look embarrassed. "No, sir, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was wrong, and there will be consequences." Harold nodded, noticing that both Peterson and Ramirez were standing awkwardly to the side, neither meeting his eyes. The crowd of neighbors had grown even larger, with some people Harold didn't even recognize joining in. Cell phones were out, everywhere, recording the scene. "I don't want those officers fired," Harold said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That wouldn't solve anything." Surprised murmurs ran through the crowd. Even Lieutenant Winters looked taken aback. "With all due respect, sir, after what they did," Winters began. Harold held up a hand. "What happened to me today happens to black men and women across this country every day. The difference is, most of them don't have the chief of police on speed dial. Most of them don't have neighbors willing to stand up and challenge authority. Most of them don't have the knowledge of the law that I have after 40 years on the bench." He turned to look directly at Peterson and Ramirez. "Firing. These officers wouldn't change the system that taught them to see an old black man as suspicious just for walking down the street. It wouldn't prevent the next unnecessary stop, the next humiliation, the next tragedy." Harold took a step toward the officers. "What I want is change. Real change. And these officers are going to help make that happen." Peterson looked up, confusion written across his face. "Sir? You and Officer Ramirez are going to join me at the community center next week," Harold said firmly. "We're going to talk about what happened today and why it happened and how we can make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone." Harold turned back to Lieutenant Winters. "And I'd like to see both officers enrolled in the implicit bias training program I helped develop last year. The one the department decided was optional for existing officers." Winters nodded. "I'll make sure of it personally, Judge." Harold's phone rang in Ramirez's hand. The officer quickly handed it back to Harold, who saw it was Chief Roberts calling. "Back." "Hello, Michael," Harold answered. "Harold, I've got a car coming to pick you up right now," the chief said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Those officers will be dealt with. I promise you." "Actually, Michael, I've been thinking," Harold replied. "How about instead of punishing these officers, we use this as a teaching moment? Not just for them, but for the whole department." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What did you have in mind?" As Harold outlined his idea, he watched the faces of the people around him, his neighbors, the lieutenant, and especially Officers Peterson and Ramirez. This wasn't about revenge, it wasn't even about justice, not really. It was about change. And sometimes change started with a phone call. 1 week later, Harold stood at the podium in the community center, looking out at the packed room. What had started as a small meeting had grown into something much bigger. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood, then through social media, and finally through the local news. Now, the old gymnasium was filled with people from all walks of life: neighbors, community activists, police officers, and city officials. Harold adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming today," he began. "I never expected my morning walk would lead to all this." A gentle ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, easing some of the tension in the room. "For those who don't know what happened, last Thursday I was stopped by police while walking in my own neighborhood. I was handcuffed and placed in a patrol car because I was, in their words, a suspicious person." Harold paused, letting the words sink in. "I've lived in that neighborhood for over 40 years. I served as a judge in this county for most of my adult life. But none of that mattered because when those officers drove by, all they saw was an old black man who didn't belong." In the front row, Chief Roberts nodded solemnly. Beside him sat Lieutenant Winters and, looking distinctly uncomfortable in their dress uniforms, Officers Peterson and Ramirez. "I could have filed a complaint," Harold continued. "I could have pushed for these officers to be punished or even fired. Many people would say they deserve it." He looked directly at Peterson, whose eyes were fixed on the floor. "But that wouldn't solve the real problem." Harold stepped away from the podium and moved to the front of the stage, wanting to speak more directly to everyone gathered. "The real problem isn't just two officers who made a bad decision. The real problem is a system that teaches police to see certain people as threats based on nothing but the color of their skin. The real problem is that what happened to me happens every day to people who don't have my connections or my platform." Mrs. Chen, who had recorded the incident on her phone, raised her hand from the second row. Harold nodded to her. "Judge Washington, the video I took has over 2 million views online now," she said. "People all over the country are talking about what happened. What do you want them to take away from this?" Harold thought for a moment. "I want them to understand that this isn't about one incident or two bad officers. It's about a pattern that's been repeating for generations. And I want them to know that we can break that pattern if we're willing to do the hard work of listening to each other and making real changes." He gestured to Chief Roberts. "The chief and I have been friends for 20 years. I swore him in when he was just a rookie officer. But that friendship didn't happen overnight. It took time and trust and a willingness to see past our differences." Chief Roberts stood and joined Harold at the front of the stage. "Judge Washington has been a mentor to me throughout my career," he said. "When I heard what happened to him, my first reaction was anger. I wanted those officers punished." He looked over at Peterson and Ramirez. "But the judge reminded me that punishment without education just creates resentment, and resentment never leads to real change." Harold nodded. "Which brings me to why we're really here today. Chief Roberts and I have developed a new training program that will be mandatory for every officer in the department. It's not just about bias training, though that's part of it. It's about building relationships with the communities you serve." A hand went up in the back of the room. Harold recognized Officer Wilson, a veteran cop who'd testified in his courtroom many times over the years. "With all due respect, Judge, we already have community policing initiatives," Wilson said. "How is this different?" "Good question," Harold replied. "This program will be led by community members, not police trainers. Officers will spend time in the neighborhoods they patrol, not just driving through, but walking the streets, meeting the people who live there, learning their stories. And most importantly, they'll be held accountable when they fall short." Chief Roberts stepped forward. "As part of this new initiative, we'll be forming a community oversight board with real authority to review complaints and recommend action. And Judge Washington has agreed to chair that board." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Mrs. Patel, sitting in the front row, began to applaud, and soon others joined in. When the applause died down, Harold gestured to Officers Peterson and Ramirez. "I've asked these two officers to come up and say a few words." The room went quiet as Peterson slowly stood and made his way to the microphone. His face was flushed, and he cleared his throat several times before speaking. I'm not good at public speaking, he began, his voice barely audible. But I need to say this. He looked directly at Harold. Judge Washington, I was wrong. Not just about who you were, but about how I approached the situation. I made assumptions based on things I never really questioned before. And I'm sorry. He turned to face the crowd. I became a police officer because I wanted to help people. Somewhere along the way, I started seeing some people as problems instead of as people who might need my help. That stops today. As Peterson stepped back, Ramirez took his place at the microphone. Unlike his partner, he looked out at the crowd directly. My parents came to this country when I was 5 years old, he said. I know what it's like to be looked at with suspicion just because of how you look or where you're from. I should have known better last week. I should have spoken up when I saw something wrong happening. He turned to Harold. I'm sorry I didn't do the right thing, sir, but I promise you, next time I will. Harold nodded his acknowledgement, genuinely moved by the young officer's words. From the audience, a teenage boy raised his hand. Harold recognized him as Darnell Thomas, who lived a few houses down from him. Yes, Darnell, Harold said. I just want to know, how are we supposed to trust these officers or any officers after what happened? Darnell asked. I walk that same street every day to get to school. Am I going to be the next person put in handcuffs for no reason? A heavy silence fell over the room. It was the question at the heart of everything. The question that had hung over communities like theirs for generations. Harold took a moment before answering. Trust isn't given, Darnell. It's earned. These officers have taken the first step by acknowledging their mistake and committing to do better. Now they need to prove it through their actions day after day, and we as a community need to hold them accountable while also giving them the chance to change. He looked around the room. That's what this program is really about. It's not just sensitivity training or community outreach. It's about rebuilding a relationship that's been broken for too long. Chief Roberts stepped forward again. Starting next month, officers Peterson and Ramirez will be assigned to a new community engagement unit. They'll be walking beats instead of driving patrol cars. They'll be attending neighborhood meetings and getting to know the people they serve. And they'll be reporting directly to Judge Washington. Peterson and Ramirez looked surprised at this last bit of news. Clearly, they hadn't been told about this part of the plan. That's right, Harold confirmed. For the next 6 months, these officers will be working under my supervision as part of their retraining. I'll be teaching them what I've learned in 72 years of being black in America. He gave the officers a small smile. I promise to be fair, but I won't be easy. A woman near the middle of the room stood up. Judge Washington, do you really think this will make a difference? Police have been brutalizing black people for centuries. What makes you think anything will change now? It was a fair question, and Harold didn't rush to answer it. He thought about his father, who had lived through Jim Crow. He thought about his grandson, who still got nervous when police cars drove by. He thought about all the steps forward and all the steps back he'd witnessed in his lifetime. I don't know if it will work, he said honestly. But I know that doing nothing guarantees nothing will change. And I know that at 72 I don't have time to wait for someone else to fix this problem. He looked at Peterson and Ramirez. These officers made a mistake, a serious one. But they're willing to learn from it. That's a start. He looked back at the woman who had asked the question. Will it be enough? Probably not. But it's a step. And change happens one step at a time. As the meeting continued, Harold felt a cautious sense of hope. He had spent his life working within the system, pushing for change from the inside. Sometimes it felt like pushing against a mountain. But sometimes, like today, the mountain moved, just a little. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. 3 months had passed since the community meeting. The late summer heat had given way to the crisp air of autumn, and the trees lining Harold Street were showing the first hints of gold and red. Harold sat on his front porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, watching as Officer Peterson made his way down the sidewalk. These morning check-ins had become part of their routine. At first, they had been awkward and tense, with Peterson clearly uncomfortable, and Harold unsure if the young officer was there out of genuine interest or merely to fulfill his requirements. But over the weeks, something had shifted between them. Morning. Judge Washington, Peterson called as he approached the house. He was in uniform but on foot, part of the new community policing initiative that had him walking the neighborhood rather than driving through it. Good morning, Officer Peterson, Harold replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Care to join me? Peterson nodded and took a seat, removing his cap. Beautiful morning. That it is, Harold agreed. How was your shift yesterday? I heard there was some excitement over on Elm Street. Just a minor fender bender, Peterson said, though Mrs. Rodriguez sure didn't think it was minor. You'd have thought someone had demolished her entire car instead of just scratching the bumper. He smiled slightly at the memory. But that car is her pride and joy, Harold said. Her son saved up for 3 years to buy it for her when he got his first real job. Context matters, Officer Peterson. David, the officer corrected him. After all these months, I think you can call me David. Harold nodded, acknowledging the small but significant shift. Context matters, David. That's something I've been trying to teach you these past months. What looks like an overreaction might make perfect sense when you know the whole story. David looked down at his hands. Like an old man walking to get coffee, not being suspicious at all when you know he's been doing it every day for years. Exactly, Harold said, taking a sip from his mug. How are the ride-alongs going with the high school students? This had been one of Harold's ideas, having officers take local teenagers on ride-alongs not to show them the tough side of policing, as such programs had often done in the past, but to give the officers a chance to see the neighborhood through young people's eyes. David's face brightened. Actually, really good. I had Darnell Thomas with me on Tuesday. Harold raised an eyebrow. Darnell? The same young man who questioned whether anyone should trust you at the community meeting? The very same, David confirmed. He didn't want to come at first. His mother practically forced him. He sat in the passenger seat with his arms crossed, wouldn't even look at me for the first hour. What changed? We got a call about a group of kids hanging out in the park after hours. Nothing serious, just a noise complaint. When we pulled up, Darnell recognized a couple of the kids. His cousin was among them. David shook his head, remembering. Before I could even get out of the car, Darnell was telling me how his cousin was a good kid, how he'd just made the honor roll, how he'd never been in trouble. And how did you respond? Harold asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. I listened, David said simply. Then I asked Darnell what he thought I should do. Harold nodded approvingly. And? He suggested we just tell them to keep the noise down and head home soon. Said they were probably just celebrating his cousin's birthday. David shrugged. So that's what we did. And you know what? They apologized, turned down their music, and promised to leave in 30 minutes. No drama, no arrests, no reports. And how did Darnell react? David smiled. He was quiet for a while after that. Then he asked if that's how I'd have handled it before what happened with you. A fair question, Harold observed. What did you tell him? The truth, that before I might have gone in hard, maybe run their IDs, probably made them leave immediately. That I might have seen a group of black teenagers in a park at night and assumed the worst. David met Harold's eyes directly. I told him I was learning to see people different. Action. This was why he had chosen this path instead of punishment, because people could change when given the chance and the right guidance. Officer Peterson, David, I want to show you something, Harold said, setting down his coffee cup. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. This came in my email yesterday. David looked at the screen. It was an email notification from the police department's new online feedback system, another of the changes that had been implemented since the incident. I want to commend Officer David Peterson for his assistance yesterday. David read aloud from the message. My grandmother fell while getting off the bus, and Officer Peterson not only helped her up, but walked her all the way home and made sure she was okay before leaving. His kindness made a difficult moment much easier. It's signed Maria Gonzalez. He looked up at Harold, a hint of pride in his expression. Her grandmother has dementia. I've helped her find her way home a few times now. Impressive, Harold said. Especially since the Gonzalez family hasn't historically had much good to say about the police. I know, David agreed. Mrs. Gonzalez told me about her son's experiences. With some officers a few years back, it wasn't good. And yet here she is sending positive feedback about you. Harold put his phone away. That's how change happens, David. One interaction at a time. From down the street came the sound of another patrol car pulling up. Officer Ramirez got out and walked toward them, carrying a folder. Morning, Judge. Morning, Peterson, he said as he approached the porch. Hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Officer Ramirez, Harold replied. David and I were just discussing the progress of our little experiment. Ramirez grinned. If by little experiment you mean the complete overhaul of how we do policing in this district, then sure. He held up the folder. I brought the latest numbers for our meeting later today. Thought you might want to see them early. Harold took the folder and opened it, scanning the statistics inside. Complaints against officers in their district were down 40% compared to the same period last year. Arrests were down 30%, but successful case resolutions were up 15%. Community feedback ratings had improved across the board. Chief Roberts is pretty excited about these numbers, Ramirez said. There's talk about expanding the program to other districts. Harold closed the folder, nodding thoughtfully. Numbers are good. Numbers get attention from the higher-ups. But the real measure of success isn't on these pages. What is it then? Ramirez asked. Harold gestured across the street, where Darnell was walking to school. The teenager noticed them looking, and after a moment's hesitation, raised his hand, in a small wave. David waved back. That, Harold said, that small gesture contains more hope than all these statistics. The three men sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as more people began to move along the sidewalks, heading to work, to school, going about their daily lives in a neighborhood that felt a little different than it had 3 months ago. We're making progress, Harold said, but we're not finished yet. What's next? David asked. Harold stood up, gathering his coffee cup. Next is phase 2. It's time to take what we've learned here and spread it further. He looked at both officers. You two have changed. You've proven it's possible. Now we need to show others that it's possible for them too. How do we do that? Ramirez asked. The same way we've done everything else, Harold replied. One step at a time. He checked his watch. And speaking of next steps, I believe we have a class of new police cadets waiting for us at the academy in an hour. First impressions matter, gentlemen. Let's make sure these young officers start their careers with the right perspective. As they walked toward Ramirez's patrol car, Harold felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The incident that had started all. This, being handcuffed and humiliated on his own street, would always be a painful memory. But from that pain had come purpose, and from that purpose had come progress. He looked back at his house, at the roses Doris had planted so many years ago. We're making a difference, my dear, he whispered, as he often did when thinking of his late wife. Not as quickly as we'd like, but we're moving forward. And in a world that so often seemed to be moving backward, that was something worth celebrating. 1 year to the day after Harold was handcuffed on his morning walk, he stood at the podium in City Hall. The council chambers were packed with people, police officers, community members, reporters, and city officials. Chief Roberts sat in the front row, alongside Mayor Williams and several council members. Officers David Peterson and Miguel Ramirez were there too, looking much more comfortable in their dress uniforms than they had a year ago. Harold adjusted his tie and looked out at the crowd. At 73, his eyes weren't what they once were, but he could still make out the faces of those who had been part of this journey. Mrs. Chen with her ever-present phone, Mrs. Patel dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, Darnell Thomas and his mother sitting proudly near the back. 1 year ago today, Harold began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. I was walking to get my morning coffee when I was stopped by police, handcuffed, and placed in the back of a patrol car. I was treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood, a neighborhood where I had lived for over 40 years. He paused, letting the words sink in. That day could have ended very differently. I could have filed complaints. I could have called the media. I could have demanded that those officers be fired. Harold looked directly at David and Miguel. Many people thought I should have done exactly that. A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the audience. Instead, I made a phone call, not to the media, but to an old friend. And that phone call started a conversation. And that conversation led to a meeting. And that meeting led to a program. And that program, Harold gestured broadly to encompass the room and everyone in it, has led us here today. Mayor Williams stepped forward, carrying a large framed document. Judge Washington, it is my honor to present you with this official proclamation from the City Council, establishing the Harold Washington Community Policing Initiative as a permanent program within our police department, with dedicated funding and staffing for the next 10 years. Applause broke out as Harold accepted the framed proclamation. He held it carefully, reading the ornate text with a small smile before setting it aside on the podium. Thank you, Mayor Williams, but this isn't really about me or my name on a program. This is about what happens when people who have every reason to be enemies choose to become partners instead. Harold stepped away from the podium and walked to where David and Miguel sat. Officers Peterson and Ramirez could have seen their assignment to this program as a punishment. They could have gone through the motions, done the minimum required, and counted the days until they could return to regular duty. Instead, they embraced the opportunity to learn and grow. They faced hard truths about themselves and their profession, and they changed, not just how they acted, but how they saw the world. He turned to address the room again. In the past year, these officers have walked over 500 miles on foot patrol in our neighborhood. They've attended 73 community meetings. They've visited every school in the district to talk with students about their experiences. And most importantly, they've shown other officers that there's a better way to do the job. Chief Roberts stood and joined Harold at the front of the room. The numbers speak for themselves, he said, clicking a remote to bring up a slide on the large screen behind them. Complaints against officers down 60%, arrests down 40%, successful case resolutions up 25%, community satisfaction ratings at an all-time high. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a map of the city with several areas highlighted. Based on these results, we're expanding the program to 5 more districts this year, with plans to cover the entire city within 3 years. Another slide. And we've had inquiries from 15 other police departments across the country who want to implement similar programs. The chief looked at Harold with genuine respect. None of this would have happened without Judge Washington's wisdom and patience. He had every right to be angry, every right to demand punishment. Instead, he chose to build something better. The applause was louder this time, many people rising to their feet. Harold waited for it to quiet down before speaking again. I appreciate the kind words, Chief, but we all know this isn't just about me. This program works because everyone involved wanted it to work. From the officers who changed their approach to the community members who were willing to give them a second chance. Harold walked back to the podium. Now, I'd like to introduce the real stars of this program, the ones who will carry it forward long after I'm gone. Officers David Peterson and Miguel Ramirez, who will be serving as training officers for the expanded program, and Darnell Thomas, who has joined our Youth Advisory Board and will be working directly with new cadets at the academy. David, Miguel, and Darnell joined Harold at the front of the room, each looking somewhat embarrassed by the attention but standing tall nonetheless. Darnell, now a high school senior, stepped to the microphone first. A year ago, I wouldn't have believed any of this was possible, he said, his voice a little shaky but gaining confidence as he spoke. I grew up being told to avoid the police, to keep my head down, to expect the worst. Now I'm helping train police officers. Sometimes life is strange like that. The audience laughed, breaking some of the tension in the room. But seriously, Darnell continued, working with officers Peterson and Ramirez has shown me that people can change when they want to. And it's shown them that teenagers like me aren't just potential troublemakers. We're part of the community too, with our own ideas about how to make things better. Miguel spoke next. When I joined the force, I thought I knew what good policing looked like. I was wrong. Good policing isn't about making arrests or showing authority, it's about building trust. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, as individuals with their own stories and struggles. Judge Washington taught us that, and it's changed everything about how I do my job. David was the last to speak. His face was serious as he approached the microphone, and he took a moment to compose himself before beginning. "A year ago, I made the worst mistake of my career," he said bluntly. "I saw a man walking down the street, and instead of seeing a respected judge, a beloved neighbor, a human being going about his day, I saw a threat. I saw someone who didn't belong." He shook his head. "I was wrong. And if Judge Washington hadn't made that phone call, if he had just demanded that I be fired, I would still be wrong today. I would have left the force angry and bitter, convinced that I was the victim of political correctness or whatever else I might have told myself to avoid the truth." David turned to look directly at Harold. Instead, this man, who had every reason to hate me, chose to teach me. He chose to believe that I could be better than I was that day. And because he believed it, eventually I started to believe it too. There were tears in David's eyes now, and he made no attempt to hide them. I can never undo what I did. I can never take back those handcuffs or those words or that humiliation. But I can spend the rest of my career trying to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. And that's exactly what I plan to do. The room was silent for a moment, the raw emotion in David's voice hanging in the air. Then slowly people began to applaud, first just a few, then more, until the entire room was on its feet. Harold looked out at the standing ovation, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was pride in what they had accomplished, hope for what was yet to come, and beneath it all, a lingering sadness for all the Harold Washingtons who hadn't had the chance to make that phone call, whose stories had ended very differently. As the applause began to die down, Harold raised his hands. "Thank you, everyone, but our work isn't done. One program in one city isn't enough. We need to keep pushing, keep learning, keep holding each other accountable. This isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a new chapter." He looked out at the faces before him, black and white, young and old, police and civilians, all united, at least for this moment, in a shared vision of what their community could become. "1 year ago, I was handcuffed on my way to get coffee," Harold said, his voice strong and clear. "Today, I'm standing here with the same officers who put those handcuffs on me, talking about how we've changed our community together. If that's possible, if that transformation is possible, then anything is possible. Remember that when the work gets hard. Remember that when it feels like nothing is changing. Remember that one phone call, one conversation, one person willing to listen can change everything." Harold Washington stepped back from the podium, feeling the weight of his 73 years, but also the lightness that comes with knowing you've done something that matters. As he made his way back to his seat, David and Miguel stepped forward, offering their arms for support. He took them not because he needed to, but because the gesture itself was the perfect symbol of everything they had built together. Strength through partnership, dignity through mutual respect, and hope through the willingness to begin again.